Welcome to another episode of McCready's Cast, where we explore the depths of health, wellness, current events, science, and philosophy. Today, I'm thrilled to be having a conversation with Angela Doss. Angela is an integrative relational somatic and spiritual counselor and coach with over 10 plus years of education and experience. She has a master's in clinical psychology with dual specializations, applied community psychology, and spiritual and depth psychology. Furthermore, she has completed additional coursework in integrative medicine and nutritional mental health, as well as cult recovery and exit counseling. Angela takes a holistic and humanizing and compassionate approach when collaborating with and supporting clients to learn and understand the irreducible role the body plays in healing and recovery. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Okay, so Angela, let's start things off by perhaps talking a little bit about what you do. I know you have extensive experience in personal coaching, eating psychology, and group work, but perhaps provide kind of a general overview of how you support the people that you work with.
Sure. Yeah. So I was a psychotherapist for several years and I transitioned. So now I'm doing personal coaching, focusing on body mindset and transformative counseling. I do occasionally work with people who struggle with eating issues. So it's a lot of just one-on-one time. Occasionally I'll work with couples or families or adolescents here and there. And then I'm also actually currently in a program, a PhD program for somatic psychology. So all of the education that you just named is not the complete picture. Actually, I'm still going and there's so much to learn and do. And yeah, so I really just love supporting people who, are finding themselves at a crossroads, at a transition moment, and they're ready for change and they're looking for just some guidance, some support. People who find me who are the best fit are usually the ones who've done some inner work and really value that one-on-one just accountability and witnessing that happens in the counseling therapeutic relationship. And yeah, I mean, really, I just love being a kind of midwife for those moments and a kind of bridge to, just the alchemy that happens between those painful, isolating moments and then the connection and growth that's possible. So that's my joy.
So you mentioned eating disorders. I'm going to put a pin in that because that's definitely something I want to explore a little later on in the conversation. But perhaps we can have a little bit of a discussion around this, transformative experience. You mentioned you were a practicing psychotherapist, but now you are a personal coach. So kind of what happened in that realm to perhaps lead you to transition roles, if you will?
Woo, I mean, that was a long inward journey that lasted several years. We were speaking a little bit before we hit record about some of the dramatic moments of the last several years in terms of, the global crisis and, the just all of the pressures around medicine and, the pandemic. So there was a lot of soul searching that happened for me. I had been part of a therapy community that I still really credit and feel so much gratitude for all of the learning and growth and just skill building that happened there. Mm-hmm. And the real just like connection and community that I experienced and came to value as part of that organization. And they were very body-based as well in the type of therapy that we practiced. It was a relational Gestalt practice. So it's all about noticing what's happening in the body and how we can pay attention to that and, use that information to really deepen our connections and make choices that feel more aligned with our values. So that was the community that I was part of. And then as the conversation began to shift and there was all of this pressure and suddenly medical mandates and, just all of this kind of culminating, in that moment, I really had to do some deep soul searching and come to terms with the fact that a lot of my colleagues were, in my view, taking an about face position on all of this bodily autonomy platform that I had thought, occupying together. And so in a way, I felt really abandoned and betrayed by that community. And, it's taken it's taken just months and years of observing the trends in conventional psychotherapeutic practice for me to really say, okay, this is moving in a direction that doesn't feel comfortable for me. It doesn't feel aligned with my values anymore. And I'm just, I find so much more freedom in my ability to practice as a personal coach and really just connect with and support people in, helping them advance in what they value. And I just found that in conventional psychotherapy, that there was more and more encroachment of my values onto others. And I'm not saying me personally, but that's sort of the position that I noticed some colleagues were taking is like, well, we have this belief about what's right and just and true, and we have to proselytize in a way to get that message out to our clients so that they come to value what we value. And that to me just feels wrong on so many levels.
When you say conventional psychotherapy, what exactly do you mean by that?
I mean the mainstream psychotherapy practice that is just prevalent. Like when you walk into psychotherapy, like when you walk into a therapist's office, I'm not sure how to expand on that, but
do you feel like limiting in a sense, like, or what are the limitations, I guess, of conventional psychotherapy? That's probably a better question to ask.
Well, so that's a better question. That helps me. Thank you.
Yeah.
So there are a number of limitations. Some of them I think can be constructive and others can be very, overly rigid. So there are some limitations in terms of, dual relationship. Like I couldn't practice therapy with my landlady or my neighbor or my best friend or whatever it is, and some of that makes a lot of sense, right? Because how can we really offer, our objective perspective or, without feeling swayed or without feeling like there's, some kind of cost that we can't just be fully transparent, right? And that's one of the benefits of actually the counselor relationship is that you do have somebody who's a little bit outside. Like, I think it's not necessarily realistic that we're never going to have relationships with people that we're counseling. So, and also just like the framework of therapy and counseling coaching for that matter, in my practice is the relationship. So the relationship is central. So I try to create an environment where, I am not the sort of blank slate style counselor that you get from a conventional therapy situation, right? Like you walk in, you don't know anything about this person, and yet you're expected to tell them all of your secrets. And so that can be like a little bit like, how do I know I can even trust this person? And especially during the last several years with all of the medical mandate stuff, that was something that was coming forward. And I was hearing from so many people about how their therapist was telling them what they needed to do with their body or judging them. And they felt more and more that they couldn't trust that person. So there are a lot of dynamics that happen in that counseling therapeutic relationship. And so it is helpful to have certain limitations in terms of the nature of that relationship in place, but always to be acknowledging the reality that we are two humans, sitting in a room, and I have my nervous system and it's doing all kinds of things, and you have your nervous system and it's doing all kinds of things. And so like, how do we track that together? And if I say something that upsets you, helping you feel empowered to have the agency to let me know how that's impacted you. That is part of the foundation of the relationship and the trust that is necessary in order to do any kind of deeper work together. So that was a really long-winded kind of roundabout way of answering that. There are other things as well, of course, like mandated reporting. As a therapist, I was required to report on certain things like child abuse, elder abuse, and just like the whole list of things that comes with that, and being essentially an agent for the state, which, and that was one of the things that I was paying attention to that kind of helped put the proverbial nail in the coffin for me was kind of watching some of the laws that were being passed in California and seeing some of the direction that things were going in terms of gender identification and the expectations on parents. And, that's such a nuanced, tender conversation. And my question about that was that, if in the courts there was this trend that I think what it was parents are, I forget. Maybe I'll just like go around that for now. But it was so impactful in terms of just putting pressure on parents that if they didn't agree, maybe this was it, if they didn't agree that their child was non-binary or trans or whatever, if they didn't agree with the way their child was identifying, that then they could potentially lose custody. And I see that, and there were terms floating around like, is it equivalent to child abuse? And so terms like that floating around, and me thinking, okay, well, in my current position as a psychotherapist, as a mandated reporter, child abuse is definitely one of the things that I'm required to report. Mm-hmm. So will I now be required, if I continue on this path, will I now be required to report a parent's questioning, like even if they're just reaching out, asking to learn more, but they're not fully on board yet with how their child is identifying, would I be required to report that as child abuse? And now there aren't any clear answers about that right now. But it was enough of a shift for me to decide that that's not the direction that I want to go. And I want to choose a different path before we would get to something like that. And that on top of what I was seeing in terms of the mandated medical procedures and my colleagues' positions on that. There was just a lot of sort of dogmatic, high pressure. Yeah, lots of that happening. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very, when you've been in a position where you've established yourself in a career, whatever that might be, and let's talk about health, for instance, whether that's psychotherapy, medicine, any sort of health regulated profession. And perhaps once you see yourself practicing in a world where you're being governed by this overseeing governing body, and then perhaps there's some views and ideologies that don't align, and that you have to question your own kind of morals and beliefs. And if you're practicing under that umbrella, can you kind of, would you ethically and morally be aligned, right? And for some people, they kind of just push that aside and still practice. And then others choose a different kind of, career path, or one where they're a little bit more free, I guess, in your case. So it takes a lot of courage to do what you did. On the note of conventional psychotherapy, I want to talk a little bit of, I guess, conventional medicine and something that you did that I saw in your post with type 1 diabetes, right? And I know I think you were diagnosed in 2008, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And if I read correctly on one of your posts, which I found really interesting, and I definitely want to talk about, where you were off insulin for a year. Is that correct? Yeah. And then you kind of treated this with diet and lifestyle, which is extremely interesting and completely unconventional. I know with type 2 diabetes, that's how I treat type 2 diabetes, right? It's diet and lifestyle. Pharmaceuticals are not sustainable for this. It's a lifestyle processed foods disease. I mean, that's clear. But type 1 diabetes is a little bit different. So can you talk to me a little bit about that experience? Because I would love to hear about it.
Woo, yeah, that was a long time ago. Yeah, and my diagnosis story is quite dramatic as well. Yeah. But yeah, so it was a couple of years after the diagnosis that, I was in a relationship at the time with a holistic health counselor and oriental medical doctor. And he had so much knowledge to share. And I really just, took everything that I could from him, just in terms of, just exposure to that whole world. And I had dabbled in it a little myself as well. Actually, after my diagnosis, I had kind of gone down the rabbit hole of some of these documentaries and like natural healing and, learned that actually probably it was a group of things, like a whole, like I had just had mercury amalgam fillings removed and not properly. I was in a relationship before my diagnosis that was incredibly tumultuous. It was on again, off again, highs and lows, kind of matches the blood sugar fluctuation pattern, right? I was in a stressful job. There were just all of these like factors that I think kind of coalesced into, what I describe as having landed in my body at this, just this moment, and, this overwhelm, and landing in the ER with a blood sugar of 1600. Yay. Yeah. So after that, of course, I wasn't really, what the doctors were explaining to me just didn't make sense to me. It just, I couldn't grasp it. And they were telling me I had done nothing wrong, which I appreciated. They were telling, but they didn't have an explanation to me that felt like it connected the dots. So I started digging on my own. I came across some documentaries on natural healing. I got really into like the primal raw food diet for a while. So just all this learning, and decided that, if I could choose what I'm putting into my body, and that choice has an effect on my blood sugar, then maybe I could make different choices and have a different outcome. And so there was a lot that I didn't know at the time. I will say that, being off of insulin for a year and just managing it with diet and exercise was definitely a learning experience. But there was a lot that I didn't know. I didn't know, for example, the role that stress plays on blood sugar.
Mhm.
And I didn't understand the role that different types of exercise could have on blood sugar. I thought food makes blood sugar go up and exercise makes blood sugar go down, and stress was inconsequential. And that was like my whole formula, which I now know was wrong, and that's okay. But what it did show me was, it showed me that I was wrong. And so learning just that was such a powerful lesson. I remember I did have some successes. I remember feeling very empowered by some of the experiences, and really getting a zoomed in look on, how simplifying my diet, simplifying my life and my workouts, did have immediate impacts. The flip side of that coin was that there were plenty of other times where I felt like I was doing everything right and getting these crazy high numbers, and I could not make sense of it. And so I would literally just like go for a walk in my neighborhood for hours, because again, I thought exercise makes blood sugar go down. And so I thought the more intense the exercise, the faster it would go down, which is wrong. And so I would literally just spend hours walking around the neighborhood, checking my blood sugar, feeling so frustrated that it wasn't going down, and crying my eyes out, and then, coming home to my partner at the time and just feeling so lost and so defeated. And after a year of that, I was like, well, I mean, I've learned a lot, but I think it's time for something else. And it was a personal reckoning where I had to really confront that it's not a shameful thing to go back on insulin. Like, that's okay. I also knew that once I went back on insulin, I would probably go back to carbs, and and I definitely had like, probably the first full week, I definitely ate like all of the carby things, and all of the, like, breakfast has been a favorite food of mine my whole life. And so breakfast has the most fun carbs. And so I definitely went to town on that. And then, it's been, it was a process of reeling that back in, and just recognizing like, we can go to extremes, and that can be okay for a finite amount of time, as long as we're learning what the boundaries and the limitations are. But I think the sweet spot, the spot where most of us thrive, is in that middle space where we're not losing our minds. We're grounded in our bodies. We can take in information and not be totally thrown by it. It took a while, but, I now define a healthy relationship with food in part by not feeling a charge when I'm in the room with the food that I used to indulge on. And so this is some of the work that I do with people around eating challenges as well. It's just like really getting to know what those foods mean for us, and, the emotional process. For me, it felt like a sense of failure if I ate a certain food that I loved. I had no idea about the actual chemistry of pleasure in the body and how that facilitates proper digestion and assimilation of nutrients. I had no idea. So it's been years of learning, and it's not over, but it's definitely, I'm so much more settled and have been for a long time. And I just I jokingly, I joke with some of my clients about how food relationship is actually the gifted class. I think there's so many avenues for growth and transformation. And food is a really hard one because we need it. We can't not eat for extended periods. So so what medicine is there in really digging deep in that relationship with food? And anyway, I could talk for hours. Let me rest and let you get a word in.
No, I want to kind of piggyback on that for a bit. When I was just thinking about like sometimes their illness becomes their identity, right? And we're going to talk, I think, a little bit about this, and that, when people have diabetes, it's I'm diabetic, or I'm anxious, or I'm depressed, and similar to yourself, I often kind of stray away when I'm working with patients from pathologizing models of diagnosis, and, often conventionally. And when I say conventional, I guess Western is a more appropriate term, because I think Eastern medicine, like Ayurvedic, Chinese medicine, that's actual conventional medicine, long before, right? And so I guess Western medicine often uses pharmaceutical agents as a first-line therapy and other invasive procedures, whether that's surgery, et cetera, and often don't utilize a more holistic natural approach first and foremost, right? And so how do you work with people when I guess their illness has become their identity? How do you kind of navigate that discussion?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I think the answer is it's so individual. I always begin with curiosity, because before I can even begin to help guide someone, I have to have a better understanding of what their journey is, and I did make the mistake when I was first really diving into my own type 1 diabetes, having all of these epiphanies, and suddenly I describe it as a kind of shaman for me. And I was having all these awarenesses and thinking, oh my God, I can help everyone if I just teach them these things. And then I had a moment where I was like, well, that's kind of hubris, Angela. What if other people's lessons are different than yours? And so I really try to just get a lay of the land. What are the themes in this person's life? How is their body potentially manifesting some expression of their consciousness, their growth journey? And it is very tied in for me with spirituality, because I think it's all happening on all levels at the same time. And so, and I also remember, I'm kind of answering your question sort of from my own experiences as well. But there was a time where, I felt like my whole life, in some respects, I had kind of been looking for a cause to plug into. And then when I was diagnosed with something, I was like, oh, I have a thing. And I felt myself really trying. And community is so necessary, especially in a moment like that where you're feeling fragmented and you need resources. So it was partly that, that need that I was trying to meet in finding others with type 1 diabetes. And I was aware at the same time of not wanting to make it my whole life. And I'll confess that there are certain pop culture references that sort of stick out for me and kind of help guide me now and then. And I really drew from the Shawshank Redemption in that moment, because I kept remembering how one of the characters was so institutionalized. That was the word, was institutionalized, and he couldn't handle freedom when he was finally released from the prison. And so I had that in mind, for better or worse, the whole time after my diagnosis. And I was like, okay, I want to hold this lightly. I want to learn what I can, and I want to build meaningful relationships and get the support I need. And I don't want this to become my whole identity. So I think just continuing to really explore what are the other parts of our lives that bring us joy. Most of us who have been diagnosed with something, there are obviously lots of children who have type 1 diabetes, for example. Some of us are adults when we're diagnosed, but for many of us with a diagnosis of some kind, we have a before and we have an after.
Mhm.
And so it's important, yes, to integrate that new information of this illness or whatever this condition is as we go forward. I think it's equally important not to lose our sense of self from before. And so for me, there was an adjustment period where I'm learning everything that I need to know, everything that conventional or we'll say modern medicine knows to teach me, which was quite lacking, as I found out years later. But, there is an integration process. There's that time of adapting. And then once things are feeling settled, that's when we can begin to really be intentional about what kind of life we want to create. And yes, there are some limitations. And there's also a lot of grief that happens in those moments, right? Like there's mourning of the life and the freedom that we once enjoyed. I once had a doctor tell me that I could never travel. Like, just don't ever get on a plane. That was unacceptable to me. I'm like, nope, I need to find a way to make this work. And it's especially helpful when you have a solid support network, when you've got loved ones and people who can just hold you up and, who even have witnessed your journey from pre-diagnosis to post-diagnosis. They know who you are. And I think it's really important for us to connect with them intentionally with that in mind, because that coherence of relationship is a powerful, powerful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things that kind of stood out for me. Is one, it was the integration part, where it's kind of doesn't define who you are, but if you kind of formulate a way to integrate this within self, that the outcome or the prognosis, if you will, be way more fulfilling. And even when you mentioned the doctor told you you couldn't travel, I know, and I've read a book, I can't remember. Oh, it's called Spontaneous Healing by he's a medical doctor, Andrew Weil or Weil, I can't pronounce his last name, but he speaks a lot about many things aside from healing, but even the importance of language that physicians, doctors use with patients. And he cited a study where there were patients that had, I guess, a terminal illness. And especially we see this so commonly in cancer, where a patient comes in, it's, cancer, and the doctor will tell them you have X amount of time to live, 6 months, 3 months. Whereas in comparison, there were patients that didn't get a time. This is kind of what we found, and we're going to do our best to kind of control this, mitigate this, reverse this, whatever the course of action was for that. And the people who didn't receive a timeline, if you will, far outlived the others. And I think that is a very specific example, but just using that just generally, when for instance, when I'm working with patients, I don't want to give timelines for anything. It's just, we're in the moment, we're going to heal, and we're going to try to figure things out, together. Which brings me to a kind of a post that you posted about on your social. And it says something along the lines of, if you don't want doctors to act like gods, then you should get off your knees. And I think this is a powerful quote. What does this mean for you?
Oh, great question. I was reading recently in my current program, Somatic Psychology, an author who was writing about how the more we become embodied, the more we become aware of our own bodies and the meanings that we're making and their relevance for our life, wow, my brain just totally
Yeah, it's happened to me before many times.
It's like so many times where I'm like talking about the body, I'm like, oh right, yeah, my body's doing a thing too. Okay, so so getting up off your knees, it's the idea. So this author was speaking to the idea of the more that we inhabit our own bodies and get to know them, the more that we are reclaiming the embodied territory that has been stolen from us in so many ways. And so I think, speaking to this actually also speaks to your earlier question as well, in terms of the identity, the identification that can come up around certain illnesses. Obviously we are more than just our bodies. We are our bodies, and we are more than our bodies. And so I think it's important both in the clinical framework, in one-on-one counseling, and in the larger global picture for us to really be curious about what's happening with the bodies. Because when we get a diagnosis, there's this immediate inclination to like, okay, well, let's throw all these things at it to fix it. And sure, like nobody wants to be about to die. Nobody wants to be in all this pain. And when we do that, we're kind of circumventing potential lessons that could be there for us. So yes, it's important to treat and to seek support and, medical professionals and, healing and all of the things. And there's this other thread that I think needs to go alongside with it, which is, what is this? What is the medicine here for me specifically? How is this asking me to grow? What is this showing me? What is my body trying to tell me with this right now? And it really shines a light, I think, on, the nature of our relationship with our bodies. Do we have a distrustful relationship with our body? Do we have an objectifying relationship with our body, a controlling relationship? Or do we have an allyship? Do we have a cooperation? And I think there's so much more healing, and I love the word medicine. I think there's so much more medicine in a cooperative, collaborative approach with the body, which is why I love holistic practices, right? Because that's what that is. It's looking at the whole picture and going, okay, this fits, this belongs. How do we work with this rather than against it, right? And so in terms of the modern medical picture, if you don't want doctors to act like gods, get up off your knees. Woo, it's such a rich quote. There's so much power that we are deferring to others. We think that we are incapable. We are told to, not do our own research because we're told we're too dumb to get it, and it's just not the case. I mean, I think so many of us have stories of having been failed by the modern medical model, and that feels to me like it's becoming the norm, that there are just things. I mean, it's just missing so much of the picture. I mean, medical doctors get like so few hours of even just basic nutritional training. And like, how does that fit? I mean, food is nourishment. Like, how can you have all of the answers when you're missing this major piece? So I think it's just really important for us to recognize that, absolutely seek teachers and resources and mentors and guides and naturopaths and like all the healing. And remember that each model is just a tool. There are many tools from which we can choose. And really the art and the alchemy is determining which tools work best for us. So I'm very anti-dogmatic when it comes to all of this.
The food and nutrition, it always gets me too, because it's so apparent that it's well known that in the medical doctor curriculum, there's very few hours of nutritional education, apart from perhaps doctors that will seek that outside in their own time for just their own general practice. But it all goes back to, Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine and let medicine be thy food. That it still holds true to this day. And like you mentioned, that is such a pivotal tool in healing, right? And I always think about hospitals nowadays. I just remember when I was studying naturopathic medicine, there was a hospital across my school, and I'd go get coffee. And in the cafeteria, there was this quote that with Hippocrates, let food be thy medicine. And what was in this cafeteria? Processed food, Subway, Tim Hortons. And I'm thinking, how is this a place for healing? How are people in a hospital going to heal, right? And even, and this was just general doctors, patients, visitors. But now when we look at patients, the food that they're getting is processed food, right? It's, from third-party food companies. All of the food is processed, packaged. It's not healthy. I personally wouldn't eat that in a healthy state. How would I expect someone who is very unhealthy or needs, the most nourishing food to heal from that? It's so bizarre to me. But I did want to kind of change lanes a little bit and talk a little bit about eating disorders. I know we mentioned that a little bit earlier on in the conversation, and I know you have experience working in this domain. And of course, with the advent of social media, there's probably affecting so many adolescents and adults in this realm. What is it working with this subset of individuals with you?
Well, so I spent about 1.5 years actually working in residential treatment for eating disorders here in Los Angeles. And it was, it was informative. I had actually just finished a program in nutrition when I was hired at this facility. And so it was really stark and unsettling to walk into their kitchen and see the foods that they provided for these very, very sick people. So yeah, there's so many things I could say about that. I will say that it like, obviously with eating disorders, like there can be an excessive focus on food. I find, and I think many clinicians and research would agree with me, that food is often not the problem. The problem is actually something much deeper. The place that I worked had an approach to eating disorders which treated them as anxiety disorders. And so their intervention for that was to expose them to foods that were unsafe in their minds. And so what that meant was all kinds of like highly processed foods, high sugar foods, packaged foods, just all like so many just junk foods, fast foods. They would have outings and they would take them to, nearby restaurants and just, and I remember feeling really kind of just confused by how if we are working to help these, I worked in an all women's facility. And so like, if we're working to help these women relax all of these rules around food, isn't it counterintuitive that the kitchen itself would require, like one of the rules that they had was they would require them to, if they ever had chips or if they ever had a sandwich, that they would be required to pair that with chips or cookies. And I remember thinking like, that's kind of strange. Like, what's that about? And so I asked a nurse one time, like, can you, because I wanted to understand, like, I really like, help me understand the logic behind this. And she said, oh, well, that's because if you go out into the world and you go to Subway sandwiches, they're going to serve you a sub sandwich with chips and a cookie. And I just thought, oh my God, we're letting the fast food corporations of America dictate our healing protocols for eating disorders.
Wow.
And it seemed to me that the standard of health based on that was to restore these women to be good consumers. And it just felt so gross to me. I just felt, I mean, that's not healing, and I definitely don't want to diminish the benefits and the experiences that plenty of people have and need in facilities like that. Like, there is a service that's provided and it can benefit some people. But that's not how I want to practice with people. And some of the work that I've done with individual clients myself, there's so much healing I think that can happen in, as long as they're in a stable place in terms of disordered eating. There's so much healing that can happen by simply engaging them on a level that is acknowledging their humanity, right? Because there are endless pathologies, there are endless diagnoses. What there's not enough of, in my opinion, is treating people as full humans, and there's such a shift that can happen when I'm engaging with somebody just human to human versus making their diagnosis or their illness or their pathology the thing that's steering the conversation. Because focusing on our shared humanity and on just the challenges of being a person in this crazy world, that's the connection that we need. That's the connection and the bridge to health, I think, that is really the most powerful.
Yeah. And I find it so interesting just when I always think about like food and health, and it's so absurd because we have a food system that pays no attention to health, and a health system that pays no attention to food. And those things are just, I don't want to say simple because of course it's a complex nuance, it's political, it's politicized, etc. But without getting that in check, we're doomed, right? And we see it time and time again. I have a couple more questions. One interesting one about plant medicines. Plant medicine. So there's, I think, ayahuasca, psilocybin, and then wachuma, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm familiar with the psilocybin and ayahuasca. I haven't had no experiences with either. I am considering for sure ayahuasca and to do that spiritual experience down south sometime. But I would love to hear your experience about the plant medicines, kind of what led you to do them, and perhaps maybe even shed some light onto someone who is thinking about it, but is just maybe a little bit unsure, or they want to hear it from someone firsthand.
Ooh, wow. Oh my goodness. Well, psilocybin is my friend. I've definitely done mushrooms many times in a variety of environments and with different types of people. And every time I feel like I get exactly what I need. And let's see, ayahuasca I've done one time in a private ceremony with my partner at the time. And that was different. I'm trying to figure out like how to give language to the different experiences of these without getting like in the minutia of my own life and my own discoveries. But I've heard people describe psilocybin as the kind of like the mother. There's sort of this mother energy, so very gentle, very loving, and I definitely felt that. And ayahuasca. Similar. My particular, I feel like it really depends on what it is, like what issue or question you're bringing to the ceremony. Obviously, plenty of people will do some of these things recreationally. I've done that very rarely. Most often I come with an intention and a question or a particular life event that I'm trying to process. And so that's my focus. Both of those mushrooms, psilocybin and ayahuasca, both definitely really helped me just kind of like zoom out in a way and just see clearly what was happening, what my choices were. And it really as much as it connected me with my feelings, it also gave me some distance from that. I think the connection with the feeling is important just to the processing of it. And then there's this clearing that happens or can happen that's happened for me. Everybody's got a different experience, but that's been my experience, is that there's a lot of feeling at first, and then there's a kind of settling, and then there's just this amazing clarity, which is where I want to live my whole life. And so I do feel like over time, having done especially psilocybin as much as I have, like there is a certain quality that comes forward that I integrate into my life that, sometimes I will like be working with a client, for example, and I feel like we're touching on these epiphanies and I'm just like, oh my God, like I feel like I'm on mushrooms right now. This is so amazing. Just because it's so clear. And then wachuma, that was, so a friend of mine actually will facilitate plant medicine ceremonies from time to time. And I hadn't done plant medicine in a while. And so I think it was a couple holidays ago that she got a group of us together and we did them at her home. And I had never tried wachuma and I was really interested. It's, I guess, the San Pedro cactus plant. And I had heard that it has this kind of fatherly energy. And I was very curious about it. I was actually just kind of, exploring male energy in my life at that time. And so hearing that this plant's connected with, the patriarch, I just felt drawn to it. And so that was a really beautiful experience. And I mean, how to summarize, like went deep. I connected with both of my grandfathers, and there was another woman there who has some psychic gifts, and she was also doing the plant medicine, and she brought these just direct messages to me from my grandfathers. And there was a lot of weeping and a lot of holding, and just, yeah, so much healing. And just, I also got to say, Wachuma, so as much as psilocybin is connected for some people with the idea of love, Wachuma was very much, for me, connected with the idea of light. And I had no sense of what the contemplation of that would look like until I was in it. And my experience of it was that I felt as if I could see my whole life and all of the events and all of the shifts and all of the meaning and all of the relationships and all the things just kind of laid out in front of me. And they were all connected, and it all made sense. And that was sort of the light experience, was that there was light shown on every aspect, as if it was all intended and as if I was being held the entire way. So there's a little just, superficial response to your question about plant medicine.
I think it was really beautifully summarized. And with plant medicine, I think the research is in its infancy, and it's amazing that we're starting to recognize the powerful effects of these substances, these natural plant substances that they have on the human psyche for spiritual growth, awakening, discovery, healing, a lot of mental distress, disturbances, PTSD, OCD. So it's amazing that finally it's coming to fruition.
Yeah.
One last question to kind of round up the discussion. I know on a lot of, on your page on Instagram, you talk a lot about your, being your authentic self, speaking your truth. I guess a lot of controversies, and when I say controversy, I always encourage open discussion, honesty, authenticity. And then in one specific post, you mentioned like spiritual awakening and enlightenment, and you mentioned, I think, you've never seen a person kind of go down the path of awakening and then say, oh, I would rather be more compliant or complicit or closed-minded. And I couldn't agree more with that statement. So my question to you is, what advice would you give to somebody who is kind of seeking truth, seeking authenticity, fulfillment, meaning, and ultimately wants to be, I guess, the best version of themselves? Because I believe that this is kind of the purpose of life.
Yeah. I mean, I think one helpful practice is to always just be asking, what might I be missing? I think there's a tendency, and this is as true as, in medicine and health as it is in awakening. I think that when we find something that seems to work, we tend to grasp it so hard, and we think that it's the truth. And often we discard all other possibilities in pursuit of that truth and in pursuit of telling the world about whatever that is. And we tend to miss so many other opportunities for growth, for connection, for healing when we do that. It's a powerful thing to always be questioning, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? What am I missing? And it has the effect of keeping us, I think, centered and grounded and humble. I have a complex relationship with the idea of truth. And I have friends who are close that disagree with me. I think that a true pursuit of truth, and I realize I'm using the word true here, stay with me, but an honest pursuit of truth knows that it will arrive. It knows that the pursuit, that the truth is in the pursuit itself. Because when we think we've found it, we've lost it. So for that, I mean, I guess that's that's what I would say. And I think I want to just name another thing real quick, which came up before, and I think it's related to this, which is, there's so much, there's so much extremism, in so many camps right now, politics and medicine and, psychology and all of the things. And I've observed a trend over time, that happens, and this is related to when we think we found a thing and we like make it the truth, when maybe it's just like, what if it's just another tool?
Mm.
There's something that I've observed happening in, healing, the healing communities, which is a trend toward deciding that we know everything that constitutes healing. We understand it completely. And if you're this, and if you're that, and if you're not doing this, or you're not feeling that, then somehow you're failing and you're not doing it right. And I see so many people, myself, people who are in my circle, who are, powerful health influencers, even, who, when they get sick with something, when they have some symptom arise, they feel so much shame because they don't feel there's space in that community for them to actually have a symptom. And I think it's in some ways it's a rational fear, because I have seen people who have built their entire platforms on healing, and one woman I know had recovered from MS, like using Terry Wall's protocol, and she'd built her whole life and her whole business around this. And then she got sick with something else and lost her entire following. I don't know what her livelihood situation is right now, but I see how disruptive and how painful this trend can be. And so I think it's really important for us to practice humility always, and to always be acknowledging there are things that we don't know. There are things that we are missing. And to be coming back continually as a practice, as a meditation, to that question of, how is this asking me to grow? And sometimes it's asking us to grow out of a community, just like my experience with psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a beautiful point to kind of end the discussion. Angela, thank you so much for taking the time and have this discussion. It was amazing. It was insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George. It was a pleasure. I appreciate it.